In 1915, between 1 million and 2 million Armenians died in Turkey, massacred in their homes or forced to march hundreds of miles to death camps in the Syrian desert. To call this a genocide is still a crime in modern Turkey. That hasn't stopped the Australian novelist Katerina Cosgrove writing Bone, Ash, Sky, a sometimes harrowing novel not just about what happened to the Armenians, but about the civil war in Beirut in the 1980s. Lebanon was where many Armenian refugees ended up. It's a tale of ethnic conflict and hatred, and of the struggle to come to terms with the legacy of past violence. Katerina Cosgrove, this started out, I imagine, as a book about the Armenian genocide, which is a controversial topic in Turkey. If you were to call it a genocide, you'd be committing a criminal offence. How does a Greek-Australian writer such as yourself come to find that as your subject?
I knew nothing about the Armenian genocide for many years, and I had a friend who was a son of Holocaust survivors, Jewish Holocaust survivors, and he always mentioned the Armenian genocide, and that's when I started researching, and the more I delved into it, the more I realised this was a forgotten history and a secret story that needed to be told. So it inspired me enough to go to Armenia and meet the people there.
Now, you're an Australian of Greek parentage, partly Greek parentage, and you've written in the past about your family, your grandmother, and the Greek Civil War in the post-war period. How far did that sort of second-hand experience of writing about a divided, violently divided society help you when you were writing this book?
It helped me in the sense that I have first-hand experience of how families and nations can be torn apart by belief. And I have first-hand experience of how people can shatter their own lives by thinking that they have a monopoly on truth. I've heard stories of my grandmother and grandfather during the Civil War where brother was against brother and child against father, and very much so as a writer I feel it in my bones. I feel the suffering of these people in Armenia, in Turkey, in Syria, in Lebanon.
Yes, because we should say that you have seen you viewed the Armenian genocide through the prism of Beirut in the 1980s and then again in the 1990s. In the 1980s, it was written by civil war. There was an Israeli invasion, effectively a siege of West Beirut. Why do it that way? Because you've made life complicated for yourself. It would have been simpler, wouldn't it, simply to have written about what happened in Armenia?
Yes. It would have been much simpler, and even my agent said to me, let's just write a story about the Armenian genocide. But for me, this book isn't just about the Armenian genocide. It's about the universality of human suffering. And the only way that I could show that was to show it in 3 different time frames with 3 completely different women's voices and a multiplicity of voices, and to show that we all have a common humanity. So if I had just written a book about the Armenian genocide, it would have been a book about goodies and baddies, whereas this book is about the fact that we have good and evil in all of us.
One of the things that strikes me is that a lot of your characters are victims of violence, but also perpetrators of violence. One is the child of Armenian refugees growing up in Beirut who becomes a Christian phalangist militiaman, and is himself complicit in the massacre of Palestinians in Sabra Shatila. Is this a deep felt belief on your part that perpetrators are themselves always, or almost always, victims?
I don't believe that that is the case, but I do have a deeply held philosophy that we are all capable of anything according to circumstance, and that we cannot judge. So that if you and I were born in a refugee camp, we don't know how that would manifest. And I do believe that we are all capable of change and growth, and my characters show that.
Why do you think we in the West don't know more about this?
I think partly we don't care, and I think partly because of the genocide denial in Turkey. But as I said, I think the more ingrained reason is because the West, in a sense, thinks of these people as somebody over there, the other, somebody different, somebody not like us. And in this book I've tried to show that they are exactly like us.
The book ends on a sort of note of qualified optimism. How difficult was it for you to wrestle that from, frankly, some deeply unpromising material? The story is one of repeated death and mayhem and murder and hatred.
I think I wouldn't call it so much hopeful at the end as realistic. And I think that when it all finishes and everything is over, that all is left is love. And my characters at the end of each individual story do find some form of love. And that's all we're left with.
Lebanon, modern Lebanon, is no longer afflicted by civil war, but it's a pretty disturbed place. The latest news from Lebanon is not good. And next door, Syria, of course, has descended into chaotic and bloody civil war. Are you an optimist? You've been to both Syria and Lebanon. Are you an optimist about the future of either of those places? Is it possible to be optimistic?
I think that the sectarian divides are so deep that it's very difficult for me to be optimistic. I also think that unless people, it comes from education, I think. Unless the children are educated to see everyone as equal and not to think they have a monopoly on truth, then there's no hope.
And is that happening?
It comes from the beginning. I don't think that's happening in any of those nations.
What do you write about next? You've written about the Greek Civil War, you've written, which is close to you personally. You've written this story, which clearly involved a lot of research. Where do you go from here?
I'm writing a post-apocalyptic eco-thriller. My concerns now are far bigger. This is a universal novel, but now I'm looking at the planet and whether we have any future here.
And what will the conclusion be?
I'm not sure yet. I'll have to write it.
All right, Katerina Cosgrove, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.